Hi, everybody. Dr. Larry, the author of Save Baseball, a prescription for the major leagues. Back with you again to talk a little Pete Rose. So, I posted a video a few days ago about the topic of Pete Rose being off the permanently ineligible list, and I weighed in on my opinion. And since then, it has been a story that has gained a lot of momentum, of course, in baseball circles. And I thought I'd revisit the conversation just a little bit today because some things really resonated with me the last few days about the conversation about Pete Rose and the integrity of the game of baseball. So, growing up, I followed baseball to the nth degree in the 70s and 80s and 90s as well. But I grew up in the 70s and 80s, and I followed guys like Pete Rose, and I really respected the way he played the game, probably more than anybody else. I don't know about you, but I've been spending some time the last few days looking back at some highlights that, of course, have come up on my social media feed, and some that I've chased down myself to find that Pete Rose was everything that I remembered him to be on the field. Somebody who gave more than the proverbial 110%. Pete Rose was baseball. I quoted him in the previous video, and I love the quote because this sums up Pete's attitude toward playing baseball. He said simply, I would walk through hell in a gasoline suit to play baseball. And I believe him. And Pete Rose gave it his all and finished his career as the all-time hits leader, over 4,000 hits. And throughout the decades that he played baseball, he didn't take a day off. I mean, he never phoned it in. I don't think he ever took an AB off. And it was his love of the game that certainly was unique to him. And you think that all baseball players would have that, but he stood out from the rest. Charlie Hustle was one of a kind. So the interesting thing about Pete Rose is that he's a very divisive personality. Even before the scandal of 1989 of him being accused of betting on baseball when he was the manager of the Cincinnati Reds, people always had an opinion about Pete. You loved him or you didn't. Pretty much was the sentiment. But when that went down in 1989, where Pete was basically banned from baseball, it was an enormous story, and it should have been. But Pete Rose paid his dues, in my opinion. And I have been, again, spending the last few days kind of looking at what others have said. I mean, there are some high and mighty folks that think that, this is disgraceful. It has allowed, one of the villains of the game who broke the cardinal sin of betting on baseball back in. Remember, Pete Rose passed away in September, so, he's not really benefiting from this, is he? And one of the people that, over my career as a sportscaster, that I held in high regard, um, my opinion has changed a little bit as we've heard some things of him politically over the last few years that don't always align with me. That's Bob Costas. I think Bob is a phenomenal broadcaster, and I always enjoyed listening to his telecasts. And when you heard Bob Costas on a game, it felt like a big game, right? Always. He just had that voice and that command. And I think he's retired now, but he was up until last year working for MLB Network, and he was doing random games, which were pretty cool to have Bob Costas on there. And I thought, all right, I wonder what his opinion's going to be. And by the way, you can have your opinion, and I'll have mine, and we can still, at the end of the day, shake hands and still love the game of baseball. But I thought Bob would have a very different opinion than what I researched, and that is he always thought that Pete Rose should have been eligible for the Hall of Fame. Be banned from baseball, meaning you can't manage, you can't coach, you can't, have a front office role. But let the voters vote and let him have an opportunity as the player he was to be considered for the Hall of Fame. And I think 100% that's a great take. And I agree wholeheartedly. He also said it seemed cruel that it happened after his passing. And I mentioned that the other day. It's really unfortunate. We're not surprised by it, but it is really unfortunate that Pete Rose never got a chance to basically, be vindicated, not from betting on baseball, but from an injustice, if you will, of not being allowed to be considered for the Hall of Fame. So it's interesting also that the commissioner at that time was Bart Giamatti. Bart Giamatti passed away soon thereafter, I think a month or two after this went down. He died of a heart attack in his early 50s, 51, I think. And what's interesting, and I just pulled this off the shelf earlier today, um, this is a baseball, as you can tell. And I've got a lot of autographs on this baseball. This is a baseball that it's a Major League Baseball that I got in, I think 1988 when I was traveling around to many Major League ballparks, and I was in Detroit, the old Tiger Stadium. What a phenomenal place that was. And the Tigers were playing the Yankees, and it was batting practice. And I was walking around the lower bowl, and Steve Sachs, if you remember Steve Sachs, played for the Yankees, most notably for the Dodgers, had a ball, and I just kind of put my hands up, and he threw me the ball, and that was pretty cool. And so I took that ball to get some autographs in 1989 because the All-Star game was in Anaheim, where I live and where I'm from, that year. So what I did was I went to the hotel where the teams were staying in Anaheim by Disneyland. Got a lot of autographs on this ball. And the one that I'm sharing with you right here on the sweet spot is Bart Giamatti. That's right. Commissioner's walking through the lobby. This is like 3 weeks before this went down. So nobody had an idea. He did probably that this was going to happen. The Pete Rose situation, of course, I'm referring to. And I, at the time, was in college and you know, hope to be a sportscaster one day, and of course, a lover of baseball. And I had a couple of minutes I was just the commissioner and I. It was kind of random. He just was walking through the lobby. Nobody approached him, and I got a chance to spend about 3 or 4 minutes with him. He was very gracious. It was the first autograph on the ball, and I thought it's interesting that he signed the sweet spot. That's a spot that is normally reserved, and I'm not saying he shouldn't have reserved for, let's say, a manager of a baseball team. So if you ever get a baseball that has like a bunch of team autographs on it, you'll see in that sweet spot, typically you've got a spot for the manager. But I've got other Hall of Famers on here. I got Ozzie Smith and Nolan Ryan, um, Gaylord Perry. That's a pretty cool All-Star game. But I just thought Bart Giamatti, here he is right here on my baseball. So let's get back to this conversation as it centers around the integrity of the game. Because that's what we've been hearing the last few days about. This goes against the integrity of baseball, allowing Pete Rose to be eligible for the Hall of Fame and off the permanently banned baseball list. By the way, Johnny Bench was interviewed. Johnny Bench, of course, Hall of Fame catcher, longtime teammate of Pete Rose with the Big Red Machine. Um, he also agreed that this is a good thing that he can be considered for the Hall of Fame. Other Hall of Famers completely disagree with Johnny Bench, but somebody asked Johnny, so what would Pete Rose's reaction be if he was living? And his response was, "It's about damn time." And you know what? That's exactly what Pete Rose would have said. But I'm perplexed in a way when I hear these sports writers and commentators, and even former ball players and Hall of Famers who we respect. But when it comes to the integrity conversation, I have a real issue with putting Pete Rose in with some of the other aspects of baseball without fully addressing these conversations. So let's first of all, and by the way, Pete Rose should have never bet on baseball. 100%. Wrong thing to do. He should have definitely received severe consequences. I don't think it should have been 35, 36 years worth, but definitely. You go into a major league clubhouse, and I've been in plenty, you see it posted, you can't escape it. It's everywhere. You can't bet on baseball. Players, coaches, anybody associated with the game. No, you cannot. So don't get me wrong and think that Pete Rose should not have been held accountable. He should have, but I think he paid his price. So let's talk about a couple of issues that I think we don't talk enough about if we really want to talk about the integrity of the game. And one of these is starting to surface again, and that's a conversation about steroid use in baseball. We remember that great summer of '98 when this guy, Mark McGwire, Sammy Sosa, the Cubs battled it out for that home run battle, and the baseball world was caught up in it. If you were around to be a part of '98, it was electric. It was entertainment. It helped bring baseball back in a big way from 1994 when we had the strike and no World Series. I was a minor league broadcaster at that time, and that was devastating for all levels of baseball. So here, fast forward 4 years, we've got this incredible home run race between Mark McGwire and Sammy Sosa of the Chicago Cubs. And what a great story until we found out that these guys were roided up. And a lot of guys were. Did you see the list of about a month ago? You know, that list that came out, it was the list. Um, Not a lot of surprises on that list. I will say this, that there are a couple of people on that list that I was hoping were not going to be on it. I'll probably save that for another conversation. One of them I know very well. Um, Grew up with him, coached him, in fact, when I was a high school coach. Um, it's very disappointing to see some people's names on that list. But nonetheless, the steroid era, and I know some folks that played during that time, good friends of mine. They were in the major leagues. And today conversations with them as we all knew people were doing it. So if they all knew that they were doing something wrong, where was Major League Baseball to step in for the integrity of the game? You know, baseball spends a lot of its time focused on history. And isn't that a great part about sports in general, but especially baseball? There's so many of us baseball fans that can recite statistics of the greatest players of all time, just rattling right off the tongue because it means so much to us. So if baseball really cared, and I'm talking about Major League Baseball, those in power then were like, we are all about the integrity of the game. They let this one just slip on by because they were benefiting from Major League Baseball's immense popularity during this time, all these home runs and phenomenal pitching performances that we had not seen ever in the game. So Major League Baseball endorsed it. It tainted the game for a long time. Guys like McGwire, they're not in the Hall of Fame. We'll save that conversation for later, but his numbers completely warrant it. His statistics, 100%. But how he got there, not everybody feels comfortable with. So I think that's something we're going to talk more about, not just me, but I think baseball in general, now that this Pete Rose thing has kind of shed some light once again on this steroid era of potential Hall of Famers. So Major League Baseball endorsed it and promoted it. You know who else did? MLB owners. You're darn right. They loved it. They had full ballparks. They had excitement. They were making money. And you know what? It's interesting. When you make money, sometimes integrity goes thrown right out the window, and I think it did in the steroid era. You know, when this all started to come out in the early 2000s and, the testing came in, you saw, though, those numbers decrease, decline. And, my book is all about saving baseball. And what do you mean save baseball? Well, because baseball's been hemorrhaging fans by the millions for about a decade and a half. Not as exciting as it once was. I talked to a 30-something young lady yesterday, and she asked me if I was going to the Diamondbacks game here in Phoenix, and I was. And I said, "How about you?" And she's like, "Yeah, baseball, it's just so boring and slow." Well, the game I ended up going to was 14-12, by the way, so it was far from boring. But you know what? Her point got me thinking again about fans aren't the casual fans not really going because they're not engaged. It's either a home run or a strikeout. We're not seeing the excitement from both sides of offense and defense that we did during the steroid era. So that's been a fallout, right, from the steroid eras. We're not seeing fans in the ballparks and tuning in like we once did. If you talk to some baseball fans, some people, A, never came back after the 94, that's 30 years ago, strike. And others who did come back, a lot of them left being a fan after what we saw with the steroid era. Another conversation piece that I think is really important to talk about when we discuss the integrity of the game. This one's a little more recent. All right, Astros fans, buckle up. This one really has been shoveled under the rug. The Astros cheated in 2017 when they won the World Series. I mean, remember they had an elaborate system of videography, banging trash cans so players would hear what certain pitches um, were coming. And I remember when the next year rolled around and the Dodgers, who were the victims of the Astros cheating in 2017, played a regular season game in 2018 in Houston. That was a cool series because, the Dodgers were livid after this all started to come out. And what was fun about that was listening to various broadcasts. I mean, I have MLB TV, as you know, so I listen a little bit to the Astros, I listen to a little bit of the Dodgers. And Oral Hershiser, who, by the way, also signed my baseball, um, phenomenal pitcher, Bulldog of Dodger fame. He's one of the color commentators on the Dodger broadcast. He said, after one of the Astros had struck out, he said, it's a little harder guessing than knowing. That's so true. So the Astros cheated. Their players were never held accountable. They were offered immunity. And how sick is that? They cheated to a degree where it ended up leading to a World Series championship. You want to talk about integrity? So all the players admitted, yes, this happened, and we are untouchable. Well, part of that is MLB has a really strong players association, i.e., union. So that benefited the players greatly. But who did suffer? AJ Hinch, the manager, and their general manager were fired. Well, AJ's landed in Detroit. As I sit here today, Detroit is at the top or close to it with best record in baseball. He's a phenomenal baseball guy. I'm glad that he landed. Although he has some accountability in this too. Clearly, he knew what was going on, but a scapegoat nonetheless, right? So I think it's absolutely disgraceful that we've allowed, even though it's been a few years now, we allowed the Astros as a franchise to get away with cheating. Pete Rose bet on baseball, but there's no evidence that he bet against his own team. Okay, he bet on his team to win, and you know what? He maybe could have managed a little differently in some of those games. It doesn't make it any better, but it's interesting because the Astros level of disgrace, nothing, zip. A few stories here and there. That was about it. Remember, the Red Sox were also kind of thrown in that, and Cora, their manager, disappeared for a year, but he came right back. So let's think about what I suggested in my book about the situation with the Houston Astros. I said, here's what should have happened to them as a franchise. They should have been banned from postseason play for at least 3 years. It's kind of like the bowl ban, in college football. You can play your season. You can be eligible to win the American League West. Matter of fact, on paper, you might even finish at the top, but guess what? You're not going to the playoffs. The number 2 team would have. That would have been impactful. That would have been devastating to a great deal for the Houston Astros. Who would have wanted to play for a team that had no prayer of going to the playoffs after coming off a World Series win? Desperate players, young players, players. Yeah, they'd fill a roster out. It'd probably look more like a triple A of yesteryear major league players. But you know what? That should have happened. They should have been sitting and watching from the sidelines, regardless of what kind of a season they had. They do it in college football. They should have done it here. 3-year ban at minimum. So the last thing I want to mention is about what's happening in Major League Baseball today. Since Pete Rose did something so horrific, and that's a little tongue in cheek, of gambling and betting on baseball, again, wrong, 100%. Isn't it interesting now that Major League Baseball is in bed with all of these betting sites, especially FanDuel? And I love FanDuel. They're great. I have nothing against them. None whatsoever. In fact, it's now the FanDuel network because Bally's, hey, Bally's, isn't that a hotel in Vegas? Yeah, that went under. So here's FanDuel to come to save the day. You can't watch a game on any network showing baseball, especially the like the MLB TV. I've talked about them and their so-called version of a red zone. It's the big inning. They talk betting lines ad nauseum. Isn't that interesting? So something that we are saying, obviously to players and front office folks, anybody associated with the game directly, you can't do it. But you know what? We're gonna, you know, proselytize ourselves basically, right? We're gonna sell our soul to the devil here, and we're gonna take all this revenue from gambling, although it's wrong and you can't do it. So I think it's very ironic that we sit in a place now where you cannot escape it. You watch major sports networks, and at the ticker at the bottom, you'll see every sport, but now it's baseball. We see who's favored. We see, run totals. There's so many prop bets that you can bet on baseball. Will there be a run scored in the first inning? How many stolen bases will there be? Remember, that only used to happen in the Super Bowl, right? We'd see all these crazy prop bets. No, I mean, I live 15 minutes from a sports book. I can go over there and bet today, um, you know, how many innings the pitcher's going to last, or how many pitches is he going to throw. I mean, it's pretty crazy. So I have an issue, not with gambling on baseball because it's legal in a lot of places. What I have an issue with is that we're speaking out of both sides of our mouth here. We're like, hey, gambling is wrong, and it is if you're in baseball. And Pete Rose should have never done it. He should have been held accountable. But hey, look who's like kicking in some big bucks over here. And I think that that is something that is a little bit perplexing, is it not? And the last thing about gambling in baseball, and this is coming down the pike one day. I don't know if it's going to be next year, 5 years, 10 years from now, is the Shohei Ohtani story. That disappeared quickly too, did it not? Remember what? Not that long ago, Shohei was in the news. Did he bet on baseball? Did he know that his shadow, his interpreter, Ipe, was betting up to 50 times a day? He says he didn't. And that story disappeared quickly. Why? Because Major League Baseball would be destroyed if it came to be that Shohei had some knowledge or more than knowledge on this. And I certainly hope he didn't. He's a phenomenal player. Obviously, we love having him in the game. But that's a story that is going to resurface one day. If you pay attention to what's happening with Ipe the interpreter, just kind of keep an eye on that story. There's some red flags there. I mean, think about what I just mentioned. Ipe and Shohei basically joined at the hip for all that time together. And you mean to tell me that Shohei didn't know this guy was betting up to 50 times a day? And I find that hard to believe. So let's get off our high horse a little bit when it comes to the integrity of the game, because we've got other stories that I think far um, exceed what we have been dealing with in terms of the Pete Rose story. Again, Pete Rose made a tremendous mistake. And I thought, and still do, think that he paid the price, and the price was pretty steep. And I think it is unfair, and I agree with Bob Costas. It seems cruel. That's a perfect descriptor for that scenario. But you got the Astros here. They just skated on by, did they not? And that really bothers me because that, I think, is incredibly wrong. And it's something we just talked about. The integrity of the game was compromised greatly. Well, we've got some other things to talk about this week. We've got some managers that are being dismissed. It's now up to, I think, three. I'm going to talk about that in the next day or two and have a breakdown of some thoughts on that. But as of now, let's see what happens with Pete Rose. See if these writers vote him in the fall the fall winterish, and well, stay tuned to it. So as always, like, comment, subscribe, and share. Thank you. And for the love of the game, I'm Dr. Larry.